Hey guys, and today I want to talk about the difference between methodical and experimental gameplay. Now, what is methodical gameplay and what is experimental gameplay? I'm going to explain. Now, for starters, we have methodical gameplay. Now, methodical gameplay presents players with obstacles and a single outcome. Players are tasked with finding the solution in which to overcome the obstacle. Failure to do so in most cases does not present an outcome, rather it prevents players from making progress. The outcome is only presented to the player when the solution has been found and executed. Then we have experimental gameplay. Now, experimental gameplay presents not only obstacles for the player, but they also present a wide array of meaningful choices. Unlike methodical games, no choice is wrong or right. Rather, the choices the player makes will branch off into new choices. The choices made will affect the variable in which decides the outcome. It is important to remember that video games are built around making choices. This includes methodical games as well. Both experimental and methodical gameplay revolve around the player's choice. The difference is in the outcome. In methodical gameplay, many of the choices available to the player will be meaningless. However, methodical games are designed with these choices in mind. The player will keep trying until they fail, and every attempt to find the solution is a stepping stone to narrowing down their choices until they find the right one. However, methodical gameplay often goes beyond just this. Sometimes methodical gameplay is designed to confuse the player intentionally by keeping the solution outside the box, in order to make it harder for players to find them. This often happens in later portions of a game, where the player may have to make a more counterintuitive approach to solving the obstacle. Now, experimental gameplay essentially involves the player navigating through a maze of choices. Rather than simply narrowing down their options, experimental games are built with experimentation in mind, and as such, the options can never be narrowed down, as every single choice a player makes has a meaningful impact in the game's progression, and every choice will affect the outcome the player is presented with. This means that the player will always keep their options open rather than narrowing them down. Experimental gameplay is designed to prevent players from narrowing their choices. Games which focus on experimental gameplay that encourage players to narrow their choices are usually flawed. Sadly, a lot of games which focus on experimental gameplay suffer from these issues, some more than others, and as such it's important to pay close attention to such flaws and consider the potential issues they may have brought to the game. Judging the severity of these flaws comes down to how focused the game is on decision-making gameplay. It is important to consider the rewarding elements first before making such judgments. Remember that all video games are flawed, and that some flawed games can actually be good games. Experimental gameplay is merely a method of delivering engagement through mastery, and by its very nature, experimental gameplay is flawed. However, the same can be said for methodical gameplay, as once the solution has been found, the game is over, unless the game provides another obstacle with yet another concealed solution which requires a completely different approach. Put simply, all games are solvable unless they focus way too much on random elements. Random elements are mostly used in experimental gameplay, but in methodical gameplay it is not common to find random elements. This is because experimental gameplay uses variables, and variables are easily influenced by random elements. The best example of this is how the dice is used in Dungeons & Dragons. The dice roll affects the variable based on the player's choice. This exists to keep the experimental gameplay more interesting, and it also helps prevent experimental gameplay from being solved. Methodical gameplay, on the other hand, relies solely on events to decide the outcome. These events are all set in stone, and as such, the use of random elements in methodical gameplay is senseless. However, this does mean that methodical games will eventually be solved, and once they are solved, the player can never truly play that game again, because the solution has been found. The problem with this is that players are able to share information which could prevent other players from actually playing the game, should they find the information out. In other words, while players can still experience the game, they can't actually play it because the solution has already been presented to them. The actual game is already over for them. All they have to do is execute it, and the execution is not playing the game. Execution is just inputting a command or an action. in a way, you could argue that sweeping a floor is an execution, and since sweeping a floor isn't a game, executing a solution is also not a game, it's work, and video games should never be work. I hope this has been interesting for you guys, and I'll see you next time.